has nothing to do with the planned economy. This is one of the great misperceptions and mistakes of the past 20 years. When you talk in the new member countries about policy, people think, there it comes again. You know, will it be 4 years or 5 years, or what sort of plan will it be? And this is not policy. Policy is a process of moderated discussion of all the relevant interests in a society, which lead to, in the best of cases, to something that is really of the common interest, of the national interest, of the public interest. And let's be quite clear. Foreign investors or employers have very particular interests. But by the way, the larger of them have policies, but these are not generally of the public interest. You know, something like Gazprom or Gaz de France or E.ON or Vattenfall, you know, they have their own company policies. And very often these policies in this region of the world are mistaken for example, the energy policy. But Gaz de France, Gazprom, E.ON, RWE, etc., they are there for gas and coal and carbohydrates, but are they there for renewable energies? Are they there for saving energy? And this example makes clear that a particular interest cannot represent the general public interest. And the other important remark about policy is, policy has to do with strategic thinking, not with prescriptions. You know, policy does not prescribe, like Lenin, what is to be done. It's an orientation. It's the end of a discussion process, and it's, by the way, an ongoing discussion process, constantly subject to revision. It leads to long-term development policies, which very often goes way beyond the next elections. You know, policy is not something necessarily directed. Environmental policies do not really have something to do with the next elections. They are. This is a much longer process. And if you think of Copenhagen and the CO2 reduction, etc., you realize that the minimum is 20 years. So anything under 20 years is not really relevant for this kind of policy debate. And thirdly, policy has to do with precautions for potential crisis. When the crisis strikes, you have to open your drawer in your desk and take out the discussed policies and try to apply them in times of crisis. Since 2008, we have seen that in Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, we had a widespread absence of policies. There was no real social policy, because government, I'm sorry, this is a critical comment on the situation, and I'm among friends, so I hope I can go on being critical. But my observation of the past 12 years and the past 18 months is that governments are far too short-term oriented. They respond to acute crisis, you know, when the numbers are really in the red in a social security system, then we have to do something. So one is they react in crisis. A second kind of reaction is, yes, they try to apply directives from Brussels or Strasbourg. You know, that is another prescription for government action, in particular also in the social fields, although the social field as such is not a European Union affair. It's still the prerogative of the states. But of course, when retirement ages are discussed in comparative terms, then one sees at what place in the league of social security system one plays, and possibly there have to be changes. The third government action is equally not exactly public interest oriented. It is very often to correct what previous coalitions have done. And this isn't always very objective. You know, sometimes I have seen things, I have seen government action in Hungary where everything was thrown out, even the third metro line in Budapest, just because this metro line was obviously a crypto-communist project by the previous socialist government. And therefore the new government, the new liberal government, threw the underground out of the plans. I thought, you know, I don't think there is a capitalist or communist underground, but I've learned otherwise. That apparently is something like that. I would like now to come back to social security and explain my perception of this. Social security, health systems are very closely related to the labor market. Now, we're discussing all sorts of reform, but if we, and I'm talking about Central Europe, including Germany, which is very close to Poland. You know, many indicators for Germany are similar to Poland, so you know, we are in a kind of group. But if we had the employment rates of the Scandinavian countries, of the Netherlands and of Austria, we wouldn't have a problem, which is a financial problem. You know, if you have 75, 78, 80% labor employment rates, then you don't have to worry about income for the social systems. You should reform constantly your systems, even if you have enough money to sustain sometimes illogical systems. You should still reform, I think. But you wouldn't have that kind of financial problem. But in Central Europe, we have employment rates under 60%, between 55 and 60%. And it is impossible in the long run to maintain health systems, social security systems, if only a little more than half of the working population contributes to these systems. So employment policy is important. But then you start thinking about another important point. You can only reach retirement ages if you didn't have just work. You need a decent work to reach retirement age. Now, if your environment is polluted, if your places of work are noisy, cold, warm, what have you, you're very unlikely to reach retirement age. And therefore, environmental policy, it has a very important influence on social policy. I mean, just think of the retirement situation in Moscow. If they have a few more summers like that, you know, people will have problems with the respiratory apparatus and will have to retire early. This is quite a clear example. And of course, if we think about the environment, we therefore also have to think about energy policy. This is all very closely related. You know, there is no possibility to separate classical social policy from the other phenomena and the other policy areas. Now I would like to point out what I have learned in the crisis in Central Europe. Now, what I have learned is that there is largely an absence of policy making, of policy experience in most governments of Central and Eastern Europe. All governments, conservative, liberal, social democratic, really only know variations of the neoliberal economic model. Variations, but essentially it is a neoliberal economic model. A few points on this. This is the model of the invisible hand of the market. you know, the market will work it all out. We don't want to have irrational intervention of governments, party political intervention in the economy. The liberals in Germany say the economy is run in and by the economy, and not by anyone else, particularly not by governments and trade unions. But we are of a different opinion, and we think that not just those who own the capital determine how our society is shaped, but all of us in a society. There's also a particular problem that I would like to point out. I said policy is a long-term thing, but if the average duration of a government in Poland before 2005 was 1 year and 5 months, and Vice Premier Pawlak once managed to be Premier for 99